My name's James. I'm an I'm an associate professor here at WIAS. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the project I've been conducting at WIAS, which is called Understanding Christian-Muslim Relations in China and Japan, 1800 to 1945. I'll begin. I'm going to review the project, its goals and frameworks a little bit, and then I'll be talking about Christian-Muslim relations in China and Japan until first till 1800 and then 1800 to 1912, before closing with a little bit about the future of the project. Right, so when I was planning this presentation, I went and looked at the presentation I gave during my interview for WIAS to see what I said I would do. So the idea of the project was to build upon research I was doing in 2018, 2019, 2020-ish. I can't remember. Maybe it was later than that, actually. But this Kakenhi project, the history of Christian-Muslim relations in China and Japan, 1549 to 1912. And I proposed some key questions for this project at the outset, which are: how did Christians and Muslims interact with each other? How did they write about each other? And to what extent was Christian-Muslim relations in China and Japan a transnational or perhaps even a global affair? Now, there's some potential significance to a project like this. No one has really explored in any detail what's been going on in Christian-Muslim relations in China and Japan. People tend to focus on the history of these religions individually, or they focus on the relations between these religions and indigenous religions, so Buddhist Muslim relations or Shinto Christian relations, things like this. But it also has the potential, exploring Christian-Muslim relations, to expand our knowledge about interfaith dialogue in East Asia more generally, and Christian-Muslim relations and interfaith dialogue in other geographic spaces as well. Now, you may have noticed something already. The title of my project is has this 1800 to 1945, but on today's goals, I've said we're ending in 1912. And this is because one of the primary issues that I've identified whilst conducting this project is the unsuitability of the period that I originally suggested. So starting in 1800, although it's perhaps appropriate for thinking about Protestant missions in China and Japan, it cuts everything sort of in half, and we're no longer able to look at patterns which exist from the 16th century onwards. So as I'm moving forward, I've actually re-extended this this focus back to 1549 rather than 1800, and then there are also some problems the other end. After 1912, there are contextual changes in Japan and in China, but primarily in Japan, which makes 1912 or the 1910s at least, a nice cutting place. There are also potentially issues, though I haven't worked out how to resolve this as of yet, with a Sino-Japanese comparison. What's happening in China is very useful in the 16th and 17th centuries for understanding also what's happening in Japan, but later, the utility of this comparison sort of breaks down. There's many reasons for this, but I think it's primarily the size of Muslim populations in the country, and the extent to which the missions in the two countries are connected. And focusing on this sort of this China-Japan framework also potentially causes one to ignore the importance of other geographic spaces, such as India, which is probably more important for both China and Japan in the 16th and 17th century than they are for each other, right? So I'm in the process then of rethinking this project a little based on these issues and some other issues we've identified. During the project, I've tried to apply the framework adopted by Douglas Pratt, which sees Christian-Muslim relations as taking 4 different forms: antipathy, affinity, appeal, and accommodation. But there are some problems with this framework as well. So they're built primarily for use on religious texts, but most of the texts that we have in China and Japan are not religious. They're trade-based or things like this. So there's questions: can these categories be applied to non-religious texts? Can these forms be applied to actual interactions rather than just sort of relations within text and things like this? There's also the possibility, and I think this happens a lot in texts we find in China and Japan, that a single text actually displays multiple forms of Christian-Muslim relations. And I'll show you an example of this later. So my solution to this has been, I think this is a generally good way to think about how Christians and Muslims are interacting with each other. But my solution has been not to take it as sort of a hard rule, but to use Pratt's categories as a means to identify the different themes that we might be finding, particularly on a micro-textual level. So by which I mean within a single passage, rather than saying, oh, this text is a polemic. I like to say, well, this text maybe has polemical elements, but also some elements of appeal, some elements of accommodation, and identifying those individual parts within a text. So let's have a little bit of a look at what's going on in Christian-Muslim relations in Japan and then China up to 1800. You may be aware, or maybe not, that Japan has had fairly long-term relations with the Middle East and Central Asia and places which we now consider part of the Muslim world. And there's some examples here on the screen of people who have visited Japan, mostly recorded in the Nihon Shoki or Shoku Nihongi, in archaeological finds and other texts. And then we have our first confirmed Muslim visitor in the 13th century in 1275. But really, all of these visits, and they're more extensive than this slide suggests, are ultimately irrelevant in the long term. Relations do not last. There is no real establishment of a long-term presence of Middle Eastern or Central Asian or Muslim peoples in Japan prior to the modern period. So the first interactions between Christians and Muslims that we're having in the country comes in this period, 1549 to 1644. And it's sort of driven by missionaries, right? Driven by Christian missionaries and traders. So Christians employ and enslave Muslims, and this is probably the primary way that Christians and Muslims are interacting. But as you may know, no one cares about slaves, no one cares about lower classes, so there's not much writings on these sorts of interactions. There's a lot of art which depicts potentially Muslim people, but there's not much really happening here. There's also the Christian transportation of Muslim traders and missionaries, perhaps. We have at least one document that tells us that the Portuguese brought a Muslim missionary to Japan. And Japanese Christians begin to travel abroad. And this is probably the most significant sort of interaction that's happening. We have the first Japanese visits to Jerusalem, for example, but there's no textual record of it, sadly. And we also have journeys of Japanese Christians. There's a gentleman called Brother Nicholas, who travels with a priest called Nicolau de Melo, and they are key figures in establishing relations between Persia and the Vatican. And they're part of this embassy from Spanish Philippines over to, well, it's meant to be to the Vatican, but they get killed along the way. But no, it's all by the by. But some important things are happening. But the texts are generally speaking very limited. And this theme of things being limited continues. In our next period, 1639 to 1854, we have very limited trade with European powers. Generally, trade is being conducted with the Dutch. And Dutch and China, if we're thinking about European powers, that is, and Dutch and Chinese trade is providing a point of contact with the Muslim world through the introduction of Middle Eastern and Central Asian goods. And the Dutch also are bringing Muslim traders to Japan, Malaysian and Indonesian traders. But generally speaking, the interactions here are not religious, right? They're all commercial, and the same can be really said. I mean, there's some religious interactions happening here, but relations are really on a commercial and labor basis. In China, things are a little more complicated, and this is partially because there's a presence of Christians prior to the 16th century, and Muslims are also present in the country from the 17th century onwards. But the 16th century does offer an acceptable starting point because really what happens prior to the 16th century has no bearing on what's happening in the early modern or modern period. We also have issues of changing borders, for example, in China, which not a question, a very big question. We can't answer it today, but what is China? I don't know, but this complicates potentially our study of Christian-Muslim relations in China. Right. So what happens? The early missionaries in China are interested in learning about why there are Muslim populations here. And they do have polemical texts, but they also have these very, I don't want to say they're neutral, but descriptive texts. So Matteo Ricci, for example, writes, since in the far western regions, China borders on Persia, at various times many followers of the Mohammedan religion entered this country, and their children and descendants multiplied so much that they have spread all over China with thousands of families. They are residing in nearly all provinces where they have sumptuous mosques, recite their prayers, are circumcised, and conduct their ceremonies. And this sort of description then becomes very typical up until the 19th century. This is the sort of thing that Christians are writing. But we also find, so within the same description, potentially antipathic statements. So it states that Muslims are in great ignorance of their own sect and are held in low opinion by the Chinese. I don't want to read quotes too much, but we have this interesting attempt at sort of impartial description, perhaps, with also these negative value judgments happening. And perhaps the most important thing that comes out of China, the Christian-Muslim relations in China, is the discovery that a place known as Cathay does not exist. So let me explain this briefly. So during the 13th and 14th century, Catholic visitors to China, they called the country Cathay, right? Later visitors did not realize that Cathay and China are the same place. Descriptions by Marco Polo, for example, they're not describing the country that later Catholic missionaries are visiting. Even the very, very basic things we might expect in a description of China, use of chopsticks or customs of drinking tea, they're not in Polo, right? So these, and perhaps most importantly, Polo says China has large Christian populations. So when these later missionaries come to China, they say, right, well, these accounts don't match. Cathay must be a different place. And this is reflected on early modern maps, right? We have this Katayo here, Cathay. We have its capital, Kambalu, as distinct places from China. Now, Muslims, very early on, from about 1600 onwards, Muslim traders are telling the Jesuits in China, yo, it's the same place, Cathay in China, right? And it takes about 10 years for Nietzsche and others to realize, oh, yeah, maybe, you know, the Muslims have told us this a lot. We've met some Jews, they're telling us the same things. Maybe Cathay and China are the same. And they report this to India. And obviously, the Jesuits in India are like, you're crazy. What are you talking about? Of course, Cathay exists. This is the equivalent, right, of me suddenly saying, yeah, Canada's not a place. Any of you ever been to Canada? No, exactly. Yeah, it's actually just the US. Roger told me. It's the same sort of thing. You'll think I'm mad if I start arguing that Canada's not a place right now. So the Indian Jesuits send this gentleman, Bento de Gois, over to find Cathay. He dons Muslim attire, he becomes a Muslim trader, although he's a Catholic missionary, and he walks with other Muslims to China, or to Cathay, sorry. And when he gets there, finds out, oh, Cathay's China. And man, this interaction then between Christians and Muslims leads to very radical changes in how Europeans are thinking about the world and map making and just conceptions of world geography. So this is very, very important. There is conflict going on as well. We're not going to get into it because I'm aware of the time, so we'll skip over that. But generally speaking, like Japan until the 19th century, not much is going on. Once we get to the 19th century, Japan begins to have a Muslim community present in the country. But viewpoints are still very much shaped by the importation of Western knowledge. But interestingly, we begin to have these first extensive accounts of Christian-Muslim interactions. So Nijima Jo, for example, meets Urabi Pasha, the former Prime Minister of Egypt, and we have this first extensive account of their interactions. Interestingly, the interactions are not religious, right? They talk a little bit about religion, but they're primarily talking about education, military matters, and things like this. And we have the first sort of religious reflections towards 1910 on Islam by Christians. So Uchimura Kanzo meets a Muslim missionary and uses this experience to argue against proselytization from any religion. And Matsumura Kaiseki, for example, uses his meeting of Muslims to argue that Christianity and Islam are basically identical. It's just the outer practices, not eating pork and things like this, which are different, and those are non-essential. We should abandon them, right? China has much more extensive interactions going on at the end of the 19th century, and Matt, the first extensive study is Marshall Broomhall's Islam in China, 1910. And whilst this is still used today, and attempts to avoid things such as generalization, it's oriented towards converting Muslims, right? That's what it's for. It's a guidebook for converting Muslims in China, effectively. Wonderful. So I will move on to the final couple of slides. It will be another 2 minutes, I believe. Please forgive me for going slightly over time. So the main themes I've been noticing, and I hope these have been highlighted a little bit. Most interactions between Christians and Muslims in China and Japan are not religious in nature, but generally based on some secular interests, such as trade. This is probably due to the sort of Muslims and Christians based, visiting and settling in the two countries, but also due to the fact that Christians aren't really interested in interreligious dialogue until the 1900s. Another thing we can observe is there is a little bit of conflict, but generally speaking, relations are quite amicable, or at least apathetic. And I imagine, though none of the sources say this explicitly, that this is probably because of this shared Abrahamic and monotheistic bond between the two religions, which are often seen as foreign within this East Asian context. Not always in China, but often. And third, and perhaps this just deletes my whole project, it's highly limited, perhaps to the extent as being virtually non-existent. That said, it does exist, and there are some important things. I've tried to mention them. The establishment of Catholic relations with Persia is one of them, which was spearheaded by Japanese and Spanish missionaries, and this discovery that Cathay does not exist. Very, very important things, which are spurred by Christian-Muslim interactions. But because of low numbers of Christians and Muslims in the two countries, because of the generally lower class status of some of these converts, the textual records on interactions that are going on are very, very limited. So moving forward then, you've already been told this, I'm refocusing then on 1549 to 1912. The monograph based on this project is supposed to be submitted in December 31st this year. We'll see how that goes. As many of you know, I'm distracted by many other projects on digital humanities things and other stuff, but that's the goal at the moment. That's what Brill's expecting, so we hope that will be the submission. I'm sorry for going a little bit over, and yeah, apologies, I didn't cover sort of the hard outputs very much, but I'm happy to talk about that later if needed. And wonderful, I'll pass back over to you then and to questions.